Hello beer geeks and welcome to an episode so geeky that even Brad decided to sit this one out. So this week we're going to be diving into one of the topics that we get asked most on this channel, and that is about what off-flavours are common in beer and how to identify them. And I can tell you from where I'm sat right now, they're pretty easy to identify. So something we talk a lot about on the channel is the fact that craft beer doesn't always mean good beer. What it really means in real layman's, in real simple terms, is it's flavour forward beer. It's beer that focuses on getting as much out of the ingredients as it possibly can, which is the opposite to the macro style of brewing. Now, what that means is there's also a lot of things that can go wrong. If you're pushing your yeast to the max, you're pushing your dry hop quantities to the max, you're using, inventive, unusual ingredients, or you're playing with your water chemistry to get the best out of it, you can start to go quite wrong quite quickly. And as beer geeks, we mostly kind of accept that there's going to be some errors, some little things that don't quite go entirely right. And to some extent, that's kind of the excitement. It's kind of the experiment. It's kind of the adventure that we're on in discovering both the great flavours and the things that don't quite work so well. It's a lot of fun. But there are some really simple, incredibly common off flavours that we really shouldn't accept in our beer because we're paying a premium for it and we want to make sure that it is at the very least enjoyable. Before we get stuck into the 6 horrible glasses in front of me, it might be worth watching our episode all about how to taste beer like a beer judge, which you can watch by clicking up here. We did that with Ray Daniels, who's the founder of the Cicerone, which is like the sommelier course but for beer. Now, we're not going to go down into the levels that the Cicerone course would with off flavours. We're going to stick to the 6 most common, and I might throw some terms at you, but mostly we're just going to be talking about the subjective elements of this, the actual flavours you're going to get. And it's worth remembering with that everybody tastes beer a little bit differently. So I'll give you a couple of flavour profiles and probably you'll get something slightly different to me. The best way to learn about this is to watch this video and then sit down with another friend who's interested and you can talk it through. And between the 2 of you or 3 of you or however many, you'll start to recognise that when they see this, you see this, and you'll start to work out what those chemicals are. So without further ado, let's get stuck into what I think, from my experience, are the 6 most common off flavours. And you'll be happy to hear there's something you can do about some of them. We're going to start over here on my right with this glass that's full of dust. So that was a fun exercise, me finding that. But it's also, not only is it common in houses, it's pretty common in beer. In fact, I'd say that this is the most common off flavour I find in modern brewing, and that's because it really afflicts very hoppy beer. So we talk about it on the channel all the time, and you'll see it in the industry all the time, about keeping beer cold and about drinking beer fresh. And that is almost exclusively the brewers and the distributors and the retailers trying to stop you getting this exact off flavour. Now, this is caused mostly when those delicious hop compounds that give us pine, citrus, resin, juicy fruits, those chemical compounds that create that start to break down, and they're broken down by lots of different processes. And they start to taste dusty and flabby and earthy and muted. And it's kind of a sliding scale, so it will start relatively slowly. For if you keep it in the fridge, it could last for 6 months without it getting it. But if you're storing it in a cool, dark place, or God forbid, even warmer, then it's going to start to drop off really quickly. Over 25 degrees, it's going to take a couple of hours. Up till that, you might have a couple of days before you really start to notice it. But it will break down all those hop compounds at those higher temperatures, accelerates the breakdown of those compounds, and you'll end up with something that's dusty, and to be honest, just a shadow of its former self. So anything that's really hoppy, you need to keep it cold, and if you can't keep it cold, you need to drink it super fresh, within a couple of days, if you can. Now, the next most common fault can also be rescued, in part, by drinking fresh and keeping cold, and that's this one. So in front of me here, I have a glass of wet cardboard, and this represents oxidation. So these are the kind of flavours that you're going to get with this process. It's going to start to smell and taste like wet paper, wet cardboard, or really cheap caramel is another thing that people talk about. So a little bit sweeter than just eating wet cardboard, but still not the most kind of attractive flavour. There's a little bit of nostalgia to this. Anybody that's been into craft beer as long as I have, so I got into it in the early 2000s. This will remind them of drinking basically the only craft beer that we could really get our hands on, which was Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, Anchor Steam and Brooklyn Lager, which we weren't getting particularly fresh. We didn't know about cold storage, and all of them had slightly oxidized notes. So, this really affects hoppy beers like those as well, and it's kind of what I remember from the early days of drinking craft beer. But there's absolutely no excuse for having that in your beer today, and if you ever taste it, you should let your retailer or distributor or brewer know that they might have an oxidization issue. It comes in packaging, so every time you package, you're letting a little bit of oxygen in, and if you keep it cold, if you keep it and drink it fresh, it's not going to be too big an issue, but the less you can get in there, the longer the shelf life of the beer. So if you're getting that wet cardboard or not particularly pleasant kind of dull caramel flavours, that probably means that something's either gone wrong in the packaging process for the brewer, or potentially you or whoever got it to you hasn't stored it in the best way possible. Next we move to our first technical term, which is diacetyl. So diacetyl is actually a flavour compound that's produced in all fermentation. So it's there at some level in every single beer, but it's often below the threshold at which humans can taste it. But the flavour is basically butter. In particular, I get kind of brown butter, or even verging on caramel again. But it's really noticeable and really different to the kind of caramel or biscuit flavours you might get from the malt. Now this is really, really common in all kinds of styles, whether it's English bitters, Czech or German lagers, IPA, all kinds of beers can get this. And some people are really, really sensitive to it. So if you don't get it so much in some beers and other people are like, oh my God, that's a diac bomb, don't worry too much about it. It's very common for people to have different levels of perception of it. Now in some styles, it's almost forgivable. I'd never say forgivable with diacetyl, but particularly Czech lagers, which already have that decoction character, it can be okay at low levels. But where it really hurts a beer is in IPA. And unfortunately, we're also seeing a huge rise of diacetyl being found in IPAs for one simple reason. And that simple reason is called hop creep. So what we've got is the situation where we're adding more and more and more dry hops to our IPAs. So more and more of these hop pellets or hop leaves in the actual beer after fermentation. And what happens is little chemical processes, little chemical reactions start to happen within the beer that breaks down further sugars. So the hop compounds and the yeast all start acting on each other and break down more starches into sugars, which results in more fermentation. And if you get more fermentation, you kick off that fermentation process again, you'll get diacetyl again, because it happens in every fermentation done by yeast. So you can start to get, particularly in can, if your cans aren't stored cold, you can start to get re-fermentation again, and you'll start to produce diacetyl again. And that will just happen in package. So it's really hard for the brewers to know that that's happening, especially if they sent out a stable product, it wasn't kept cold, and suddenly they've got customers coming back to them going, there's diacetyl in this beer. So there's stuff that the brewers can do to prevent that, but the most important thing is that the distributor, the retailer, are storing it cold, and that you're storing it cold to stop that hop creep process beginning. Now we move on to one that's talked about a lot, particularly if you're really into IPAs. And some people seem to kind of enjoy these flavours. I don't quite know how. But this is a garlic bulb in a glass. You also might get very strong green onion kind of characters to these beers that have this flaw. And also a horrible thing called hop burn. Now, these are beers that perhaps haven't been given time and tank to round out. So when you add, these incredibly bitter, incredibly aromatic plants in dry hop, you're going to start to get huge, huge green hop flavours in that tank. And certain hops take longer to round out. Galaxy, with its oil contents, is really famous for taking ages to lose that kind of green hop, garlic, onion kind of burn. That is just literally really fresh, organic hop compounds that need to be broken down or rounded out during that process, particularly at cold temperatures. Now, loads and loads of brewers, because of this fetishization around freshness, which I've been doing my best to create here as well, brewers are putting out their beers younger and younger and younger and younger. And that's probably advisable, because it means that by the time it hits you, it's probably not going to happen unless you're buying straight from the brewery. It's not going to happen straight away. So it's giving another week in package for it to round out. But sometimes if you're buying direct, or if they've released it really young, or if they haven't done the sensory analysis, this kind of flavour can end up in your glass, and it's really nasty. Particularly hot burn can be like this acidic burn all the way down there that you'll get as you drink it. And if you get a can towards the end of the canning run and you start to get sediment and stuff like that, it can get really painful and really kind of mess up your palate for the rest of the day, because that's all you can kind of taste from then on. So when I say drink fresh, that comes with a small caveat. Look at the canning date, and usually IPAs are going to peak between 2 and 6 weeks from the packaging date if it's kept cold. Okay, now we're going to move on to one that isn't so much niche, but it's just very particular to the UK, and that is acetic. Now, acetic is created by a bacteria called Acetobacter, and it's basically an organism, it's a bacteria that thrives in high oxygen environments, or even with a little bit of oxygen, and that's why it's most common in cask ale. So when you crack a cask ale, which if you don't know what that is, link up here, it's basically beer that's been conditioned and to some extent carbonated in the barrel that it's then served from. And when you open these cask beers, you let in oxygen, and as you pump it out, more oxygen's coming in. And what that means is, over a process of usually about 3 to 4 days, acetic will start to grow and create this horrible vinegary flavour, very close to balsamic vinegar, which is what I've got in this glass and what I've been smelling throughout the entirety of filming this. Now, this kind of flavour can be quite nice in lambics, and particularly in Flemish reds, in these sours where you want a kind of a real bite and a real rich, deep, flavourful bite that something like balsamic would have. But obviously in a bitter or a mild or a porter, it's absolutely rancid. And it's really, really common in cask ale. It's one of the biggest issues with serving cask, the fact that you only have a matter of days from cracking that cask before you'll start to get notes of acetic, notes of vinegar coming through. And before that even happens, you'll start to get this flavour, you'll start to get oxidation. So you'll start to get that wet cardboard in the really hoppy cask ales. So although cask ale is brilliant, and for me it is the best way to serve beer for that first 24 to 48 hours, it gets trickier for the next 48. And now we move on to my final glass, my most full glass, which is full of delicious fruits and some very fetching red nail polish. Now these are the acetate kind of based chemicals, and the reason I've left this until last is because A, there's loads of them, and B, actually in certain styles they are totally fine. So you know, probably if you're watching this, you know about Bavarian Hefeweizens, which famously have banana or foam banana kind of flavours that come during the fermentation of that particular yeast, and that's great, it's delicious with the clove and the wheat, it's just beautiful. You also might have had some Belgian ales where you've got this apple skin, particularly green apple skin flavours, and that's totally fine as well. It's really famous, you get it in lots of Trappist beers in particular, particularly Chimay, the bigger Chimay beers all have that kind of character to them, and particularly the Chimays as well also have a hint of nail polish to them. In just small quantities, particularly the blonde Chimays, and that can be really delicious. It's so incredibly aromatic that in just tiny quantities it can add to that fruitiness, but it can be way too much. Now, outside of those kind of styles that I've just mentioned, you should not be getting any of these flavours. But particularly the green apple skin and the banana, you will get those in pretty much all fermentations at different levels, and particularly in pale lagers where there's lots of room for these other flavours to breathe because there's not so much hop or malt character or other yeast character coming through. These guys can really start to sing, and that's why a long lagering process is important, because the yeast will come back and clean up those extra flavours towards the end of that lagering process. So any lager or pale beer that has these, it's probably either been fermented too warm and for too long, or it's not been lagered for long enough and they've left those flavours in there and they've packaged it too quickly. So that's a quick rundown of the most common off flavours that we get in modern beer. Now, of course, there's loads of other ways that beer could go wrong. You could end up with stuff that smells like baby sick, that's butyric, or stuff that smells like a damp cellar, that's absolutely disgusting, or stuff that smells of Parmesan cheese, which is isovaleric acid, and all other kinds of stuff that are a little bit more rare, a little bit more niche, usually particular to sour beers as well. But with every single style of beer, you can combat these things. And the first thing you need to do is to trust the brewery that you're buying from and to trust the styles that they're making. So go to breweries that you know are really good at it, or that say the right things on the package or in the marketing, so that you know, this beer has been, this lager's been lagered for long enough, or this Galaxy beer has had a good amount of time in tank, or, we're using the freshest 2020 hops, just the last harvest, and little things like that. And you can go like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get dust or oxidation. You will see occasionally, I love it when brewers boast about their parts per million of oxygen going into their packaging lines. They literally do talk about that, if you want to get that geeky about it. The other thing you need to do is to know where you're buying from and store it right. So go to retailers that are keeping their beers in the fridge, and also, if possible, before that stuff ends up in the fridge, keeping it cold in their own storage, and are working with distros that use cold storage, working with breweries that care about that kind of thing. You can ask those questions. If people don't know, that's fine, take a punt and you'll learn from that. If it's good, you can trust them. If it's not, maybe don't do it again. But it's important to ask those questions. And the final thing is, if you do find a flaw, don't be a dick about it. Don't necessarily put it on Untapped unless you're constantly getting it from the brewery, and let the brewery or the retailer or the distributor know that something's gone wrong, because if they don't know, then they can't act on it, particularly with stuff like diacetyl, which might be caused by hop creep, where it's happening once they've left the brewery. They just might not know about that, and they might need to speak to the people that they work with to ensure that doesn't happen. So like I said at the start, there's loads of resources you can go to. You can find out about cask ale up here. You can find out how to taste beer like a beer judge. And then we've also got a video which asks, are you buying your craft beer wrong? In which we look at an independent bottle shop and look at the best ways to buy craft beer to get both bargains and to get the best quality beer there is. If you've got any questions, hit us up in the comments below, and I will endeavour to answer as many as I can and look up the answers to the ones that I don't know. And if you want to ask me and Brad questions whenever, you can just join our Patreon from $1 a month. There's a link in the descriptor below. You can join our forum, where we're there every day answering questions and chatting to our amazing 350-ish supporters in there. So I'm going to have a nice, clean, unfaulty lager here and move as far away as I can from these glasses now. Cheers.